can probably make it up. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here for this event. Can I just check everyone can hear what I'm saying? Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. So my name's James Baxter. I'm Australia's ambassador to the World Trade Organization, and I think many people in this zone might wonder what I'm doing here. But I hope that some of the people who are in the audience here realise that it is there is a relevance to my participation here in this bigger COP event, and definitely what we are trying to do is strengthen the sense that the trade and climate communities need to come together. So it's against that background that we have called on the good offices of the participants in this panel to talk a bit about how we can use trade to drive climate and environmental outcomes. We plan to go for about an hour. As I said, I'm Australia's permanent representative to the World Trade Organization, and it's my very first COP, and it's a very interesting experience. But we have a distinguished panel, a far more distinguished panel than the likes of me, joining us this morning, led by the Honourable Fekita Utoikamanu, who's the Minister of Meteorology, Energy, Information, Disaster Management, Environment, Climate Change and Communications from the Kingdom of Tonga. Welcome so much, Minister. It's great to have you here. And the Minister was formerly the Foreign Minister of Tonga and has played a number of crucial roles in the Tongan government over the year. She also holds a Bachelor and Master of Commerce from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Our second panellist is Alice Tipping, who's the Director of Trade and Sustainable Development at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. That is a very highly regarded think tank that many of you will be aware of. Alice has designed and led highly respected programs on research and policy dialogues on trade and environment issues, on fisheries subsidies, and I can tell you as a country that's very interested in the fisheries subsidies negotiations, those dialogues have played an important motivating role in bringing those negotiations towards a successful, I hope, conclusion. Alice has played a number of roles in the environment and sustainability area over the years, including as a program manager at the Environment and Natural Resources for the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development, as well as being a policy advisor to New Zealand's permanent mission to the UN, and a legal advisor in New Zealand's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization. So it brings a wealth of broader expertise as well as technical knowledge to these discussions. And then I'm really pleased as well to have Professor Frank Yotso here. Frank is Head of Energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, the ANU being the Australian National University. Importantly, at the moment, Frank is heading up the Australian government's carbon leakage review, which is something that is creating considerable interest in Australia and internationally. And he has a wealth of expertise in climate and economics. So perhaps before we go to hearing from the panelists, a few words from me. It's obvious that just being here, we know how important the environmental challenges we face are. We know how much governments are investing in them. We know we're struggling to get to the targets that we're setting for ourselves, including the 1.5 degree target. And we know that we're trying to move towards achieving these targets in a climate of rising geostrategic competition that are really testing some of the cooperative mechanisms we've had in place in recent decades to tackle global global problems. And as I've suggested, one of the voices that we are hearing a little bit more of, but we think we need to hear more of, is the trade voice. What role can trade play in helping government achieve their objectives? We know that trade is integral to economic activity in all countries. It powers production and consumption across the globe. The WTO and UN Conference on Trade and Development have estimated that global trade to GDP rose from 20 to 30% in the last 30 years. So it's increasingly important as an area of economic activity. And correspondingly, greenhouse gas emissions generated by traded goods and services have increased. So now about a quarter of CO2 emissions are embedded in traded goods. That's in the supply chains, production processes, and transport needed to make the products that we need, the products that we make and the products that we need. Against that background, it's clear that well-designed trade flows, good trade policy, can play a role in achieving climate and environmental ambitions. And to achieve good trade policy, countries need to work together at the global level to tackle together ways of identifying sustainable, inclusive development approaches to trade with each other. And it's that need for global cooperation indeed that's brought us all together in Baku, not just us, but whatever it is, tens of thousands of delegates who are here. And trade, in our view, offers substantial possibilities for us all as we seek to achieve those goals. But there are also some risks that have been posed. And we need to talk together about both the risks and the opportunities if we're going to maximise the opportunities and minimise the risk. And it's really that sort of discussion that we are trying to promote here as part of the trade community in the climate context. So a couple of key messages from me. First of all, we do think that the discussion of trade is underdone in the global climate and environmental discussions. Trade can, as we've seen in other forums, facilitate the transfer of technologies, and that's something relevant to the transfer of low carbon technologies. Trade, as we've seen, can be undertaken in ways that promote conservation or undermine conservation efforts. And that's something that we need to bear in mind as we're having a discussion about achieving climate goals. And trade can be undertaken in ways that bolster the well-being of local communities or in ways that are seen as risks to the welfare of local communities. And that's an important factor for us all as well. There are opportunities here. If we look at the way that technology is progressing, the rapidity with which it's progressing, if you're thinking about things like the development of solar panel technology, about the development of wind and battery components, and the role they are going to play in decarbonising our economies around the world, trade will have a multiplying effect on their impacts if it's undertaken in a positive way. Similarly, trade can play an important role in the exchange of expertise across economies. And that's something that, again, is going to be important to many smaller and developing economies as they seek to tackle their Paris goals. On the other side, we think about some government programs in place to support sectors of the economy such as agriculture. We have research showing that agricultural subsidies, trade distorting agricultural subsidies, can have a detrimental impact on the environment. How can we talk about those issues in ways that help governments achieve goals for agricultural production and development without undermining their environmental objectives? If we're thinking about things like standards, How can we promote the use of sustainability, sustainable products through the development of standards in ways that don't discriminate against other countries unnecessarily? These are the sorts of things that can only benefit from our talking together as governments, and indeed among governments with business and civil society. And it's in that sort of context that we are hoping to have an exchange today. And just picking up on that, that last part, for my second point, inclusion and equity are going to be an important part of the conversation for many. Without careful collaboration, we've seen the potential for climate and trade policies to exacerbate divides between developed and developing countries. We've seen countries, major economies, develop measures to achieve climate goals that are seen as having an unfair impact on developing countries and their economic prospects. That's something that we as Australia believe needs to be addressed through a cooperative framework, and that if we do address it cooperatively, we can hope for better outcomes. We want to see the playing field in this area develop in a way that increases equity rather than tilting towards larger, more industrialised, more powerful economies. And then at the community level, we need to think about inclusion as well. We've seen a growing disenchantment at the community level with trade in some, but not all countries, about the fact that trade outcomes or the benefits of trade may not be shared equally. In Australia, one of the things we've been very consciously seeking to do over the last couple of years is increase the participation of our Indigenous people in international trade. That's only just starting, and it's difficult work for us. As a government, we are not used to talking to Indigenous communities in an open way about what they what they might be able to do to benefit from trade, and listening to them about their own economic aspirations and translating that into trade policy. But that's something that's changed with the appointment of our first Indigenous ambassador, Justin Mohammed. And we've seen that translate into the international arena with rulemaking in areas relating to things like the protection of intellectual property related to genetic resources that have been developed by Indigenous communities over centuries, if not millennia. But that's another dimension that we need to bear in mind as we're having this conversation. And the third point I'd make is that we need to be very deliberate in building connections between trade and environmental or climate regimes. So if we accept the logic that trade has the potential to enhance our capacity to meet climate goals, and that achieving our climate goals can be undertaken in a way that promotes economic opportunity, then we need to be prepared to invest in efforts to promote that sort of outcome. It won't happen organically. The COPs go on without necessarily resorting to consultation of policymakers and stakeholders who affect how trade policies are developed and trade regimes is developed. In the World Trade Organization, I would say frankly that for too long we have not paid close enough attention to developments that are going on in the environmental community, whether it's in the climate area or otherwise. But I would say, and I may be a bit provocative saying this here, that I think the trade community is positioning itself better in that area, and my contention would be that we're actually a bit ahead of the climate community in talking about the links between the climate regime and the trade regime. And that's something that we'd like to change. We want both regimes to be talking to each other on the basis of an equal understanding, and on the basis that if they work together properly, the outcomes that both are seeking to achieve are more likely. So that's enough from me. I'm hoping now to turn this into a conversation rather than a monologue, which I'm sure you'll all find much more rewarding. And I'd ask our panelists to join us up on the stage here to do that. Thank you. So this is the completely unscripted bit, and I'm really looking forward to it. The only bit I've scripted is that we are going to hear first from the Minister. So over to you, Minister, please.
Yes. Thank you very much, Excellencies, Malolele, and warm Pacific greetings. Thank you for the opportunity to share the Pacific's perspective at this COP29 side event. I think it's crucial to discuss the interconnectedness of trade, climate change, and sustainable development. And this is not just about economic growth, it's about our very existence in a world grappling with the effects and impacts of climate change. Our diverse viewpoints and experiences are essential to ensure that sustainable trade is fair, inclusive, and beneficial for all. To ensure that all countries are included and none are left behind, we must adopt a multifaceted approach that recognizes the diverse needs and capacities of all nations, particularly those in the Pacific and the small island developing states. We must champion the establishment of equitable trade agreements that duly account for the vulnerabilities faced by small island developing states. For instance, Tonga's participation in the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relation, PESA Plus, aims to enhance trade opportunities while ensuring that our specific needs are addressed, particularly in terms of capacity building and market access. These agreements should incorporate provisions that offer flexibility in fulfilling trade obligations, acknowledging the distinctive challenges posed by our geographical isolation and limited resources. And only through such considerate and fair arrangements can we hope to address the disparities and foster a more balanced global environment. Secondly, capacity building and technical assistance are crucial for small island developing states to participate actively in sustained trade practices. By providing targeted support, including access to advanced technology, comprehensive training, and essential resources, we can significantly enhance our ability to develop and implement sustainable practices with our local economies. Tonga has started programs to develop local industries, such as the establishment of the Tonga Export Strategy, which focuses on improving the quality and marketability of our agricultural products, empowering local farmers and businesses. And this strategic investment strengthens our economic resilience and promotes sustainable growth, allowing SIDS to contribute significantly to and thrive within the global marketplace. Third, it is imperative that the voices of the Pacific nations and small island developing states are not only heard, but also actively included in international trade discussions. And this involves a committed effort to integrate our nations into the development of policies and agreements that shape their futures. By doing so, we ensure that our unique perspectives and pressing needs are not sidelined, but prioritized in the global economic landscape. This inclusive approach is not only just, but essential for equitable and sustainable progress. Trade policy can be a powerful tool for the Pacific and small island developing states as we confront climate change. Therefore, it must incorporate the following set of strategies to support the Pacific and small island developing states. First, harnessing the blue economy. The blue economy holds unparalleled potential for sustainable development in the Pacific region. And it is imperative that we harness this opportunity by implementing forward-thinking trade policies. We can bolster economic growth while preserving our invaluable marine ecosystems for future generations by prioritizing sustainable fisheries, marine conservation, and the responsible use of ocean resources. Tonga's commitment to sustainable fisheries management, as outlined in our national fisheries policy, emphasizes the importance of responsible fishing practices and as well as the marine conservation, which can enhance trade opportunities while safeguarding our marine ecosystems. Secondly, promoting green goods and services is essential. By prioritizing trade of environmentally friendly products, we can stimulate economic growth while addressing climate change. And this includes supporting industries that produce renewable energy technologies and sustainable agricultural practices, which can lead to a more resilient economy. Thirdly, integrating circular economy initiatives into our trade policies is vital. By encouraging the reuse, recycling, and sustainable management of resources, we can minimize waste and promote sustainable consumption patterns. And this approach not only benefits the environment but also creates new economic opportunities for small island developing states. Fourthly, climate finance through trade must be emphasized. By leveraging trade agreements to secure climate finance, we can support small island developing countries in implementing climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And this financial support is crucial for building resilience against the impacts of climate change. Fifth, we must consider carbon border adjustments as mechanisms to level the playing field in SIDS. By implementing policies that account for the carbon footprint of imported goods, we can encourage sustainable production practices and protect our local industries from unfair competition. These initiatives will not only boost our economy but also protect the environment for future generations, making it our duty to take action with determination and purpose. To effectively address the interconnectedness challenges of trade, climate change, and biodiversity loss, we need to foster cooperation and develop integrated policy approaches to tackle that bring together people from all these areas. And such collaboration will facilitate the sharing of knowledge, best practice, and resources, ensuring that our initiatives are not only aligned but also mutually reinforcing. At the same time, it's also critical to develop integrated policy approaches that acknowledge and leverage the interdependencies amongst trade, climate, and biodiversity. And by aligning our objectives, we can create synergies that amplify our collective impact, driving us towards more sustainable outcomes. Finally, the importance of strengthening international partnerships cannot be overstated. And by working closely with international organizations, regional organizations, governments, and civil society, and building on existing initiatives, we can increase our resilience and ability to tackle climate change while supporting sustainable trade. To secure a sustainable future, these strategies are not only desirable but essential. And by committing to inclusive and sustainable trade practices, we can empower small island developing states to thrive in a changing world. And let us work together to build a resilient global community that prioritizes environmental sustainability, social equity, and economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. That was just a wonderful account of how a small island state is grappling with the challenges of economic growth and sustainability. And I think the points you made about fairness being the basis for international relations is really at the heart of the debate that we need to have. The centrality of resilience and sustainability to planning, I think, is absolutely spot on, and I'm confident that that is something that Alice has given a lot of thought to. Well, I know Alice has given a lot of thought to, and interested to hear some of your thinking right now on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. And I'm, as you were saying, originally from New Zealand, so I can say kia ora to everyone. And tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. It's wonderful to see you here. And thank you in particular to the Australian government for the opportunity to say a few words about, I think, a topic that's dear to all of our hearts, and that's how we design trade policy to shape trade flows so they actually support climate protection and the protection of nature. And as you were saying at the beginning, Ambassador, yes, trade can be a critical enabler of support to nature and of climate mitigation and of climate adaptation, but really only if the policy that governs that trade is well designed. So let me give you a few examples of policy developments that I've seen in the last few years that I think have done really well and are examples of what we should do going forward. And it's two examples about subsidies, which for the trade and economics people in the room will be a favourite topic, and one about adaptation. And the Minister talked precisely about the importance of adaptation for small island developing states, right? This is not a nice to have, this is an existential statehood question for some. So let me start with subsidies. And the Minister's mentioned the importance of the blue economy in the Pacific. What many of you perhaps don't realise is that half of the tuna that we eat comes from the Western and Central Pacific. Half of it. So the next time you eat tuna, 2 of the servings you'll have were from the Western Central Pacific. This is critical not only to global fisheries but to the economies of the region. And one thing that we have seen progress really well at the WTO is an agreement, a legally binding multilateral treaty controlling the way that governments subsidise their fishing sector, right? So we had an agreement reached in 2022 in Geneva under which governments agree not to subsidise vessels or operators engaged in illegal fishing. They agree not to subsidise the fishing of overfished or already depleted fish stocks. And really importantly, they agree not to subsidise fisheries that aren't regulated on the high seas. Now, these are 3 really important rules about how governments engage in trade policy and how they shape these parts of the economy. And as the Ambassador was saying, this is a topic that we as an institute have worked on really hard. We're very close, I think, very, very close to getting additional provisions in place, agreed in a legally binding treaty that will make sure that government subsidies don't lead to overfishing in the first place. So that's one really good example. The other example, and I hope I'm not breaking any embargoes here, but you'll see probably coming out on the news today, is the launch of the texts of the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. Now, this is not a big multilateral agreement. It's an agreement between New Zealand, Costa Rica, Iceland and Switzerland. There's only 4 of them. But what's really interesting about this agreement, and have a look at the text when it's released today, is that there is the first formal prohibition on fossil fuel subsidies in that treaty, legally binding treaty. And so we have in the fisheries subsidies agreement a large, sort of lowest common denominator, but still really important multilateral treaty. We have in the ACCTS a sort of pathfinder example of how governments can agree not to subsidise fossil fuel subsidies. Or to subsidise fossil fuels, rather. So that's two subsidies examples. And the last point on adaptation, the Minister was talking about the importance of environmental goods and services and those that can help countries to implement their national adaptation plans. And you'll have seen in a number of global network sessions at the COP just how important adaptation planning is. But the other part of the discussion, and this brings in the equity point that the Ambassador was talking about, in the trade context, I find that a lot of the trade and climate discussion has been, forgive me, like quite developed country-led. It's been a lot about mitigation. It's been a lot about the environmental goods and services we need to mitigate climate change. And one of the objectives of a project that we have underway with support of the Australian government is to bring the adaptation perspective into the trade policy discussion, right? So reframing the debate so it's more about what we all have a collective interest in, rather than walking straight into the CBDR argument about, what should developing countries do, what should developed countries do. And that leads me to the equity point, right? Equity is hugely important, not just in the substance, but also in the politics of how we move together, I think, as governments and as countries. I was at the Turkish Pavilion yesterday talking about the idea, and I'd be interested to have a discussion with Professor Jotso on this, about the idea that revenues from border carbon adjustments could be used to support decarbonisation in the countries paying those revenues, right? So how do we design trade measures for mitigation or adaptation, but how do we design them in a way that those who are moving fast and moving fastest lift others and bring others with them? That's, essentially the Paris Agreement takes us into a world where some countries should move faster. They're asked to move faster. So we can't blame them for moving faster. That's what we ask them to do. But what we can ask them to do is to make sure that they bring everyone else along with them. Because otherwise, and I see this in a number of sectors, I was talking to the New Zealand dairy industry the other day, and they said, listen, we can do whatever we like, but the drag on progress in the industry is coming from countries that don't have the resources to invest like we do. Right? So you can have a perfectly sustainable dairy industry in 2 countries, but if the rest of the industry isn't following, you're not achieving the global change you want to.
Thank you so much, Alice. That's for me. That's very positive. I think Alice has identified that these things can be done. The progress can be made, whether it's whether it's a global effort or whether it's a smaller effort that may lead to a broadening out of more players over time. And I think that's something that it can be very difficult to keep hold of that optimism, that sense that it is possible. But we do have some examples where that's been achieved, and where I think we've done so in a way that is equitable and fair, and builds in the sort of resilience and sustainability that's going to be crucial. Now, if I can move to Dr. Jotso, who is giving a lot of thought to precisely the question of designing good policy, and in the process designing good process. Over to you, please, Frank.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'd like to make some remarks with regard to energy-intensive commodities and their trade in a world economy that decarbonizes. And so that raises some really large questions, because the shift to low emissions and ultimately zero emissions production systems does imply, obviously, major changes in energy trade flows, but perhaps less obviously it will also imply a reorganization of the global geography of heavy industry, because it will be, if we come to an efficient outcome, it will be more prominently located in geographies that offer plentiful and cheap clean energy supply, in particular renewable energy supply. And so obviously the global trade framework has an important role in facilitating economically efficient outcomes in that future decarbonized world economy. It's tremendously important that we do that transition at least cost, and that we arrive at long-term sustainable patterns of industrial production that actually minimize overall costs, because that is, minimizing costs is the underpinning actually of support for climate policy, right? None of this can be too expensive. Now, in terms of trade policy and the intersection with climate change, I think we can really observe that this is here. This will be here with us, and the challenge and the task is to square the objectives of the climate regime and decarbonization, staying below 2 degrees, and the objectives of the global trade regime. That's before us, and that's the task. Now, in measures that individual countries and groups of countries, jurisdictions are preparing, the goal ought to be to work towards an open and to maintain an open and efficient trade regime, and to make sure that trade regime can contribute to climate change objectives. And so, in a concrete sense, for energy-intensive and emissions-intensive industries, what that ought to mean is not to put the emphasis on shielding existing high-emitting industrial structures from change, but to help promote efficient change towards low and zero emissions industries, okay? And to do that in a way that does indeed provide that level playing field that you referred to, Minister, with regard to the potential of border carbon adjustment measures, and to do that in a way that doesn't leave any jurisdiction, that doesn't leave any country behind. And that's very important with regard to developing countries, right? And so there is, of course, different ways of approaching the issues. And one way is to say, okay, so let's make sure that there is not too much adjustment pressures on developing countries. On the other hand, of course, right, the perspective also needs to be, let's make sure that developing countries have every opportunity to actually be on board with that transition to low and zero emissions industrial structures, because those are the structures that will carry the economic benefit in decades to come, hopefully in centuries to come. Right? Now, with regard to the carbon leakage review that you mentioned, Ambassador, so this is an effort to understand deeply whether a carbon leakage risk exists for Australian heavy industry, and if so, what can be done in addition to existing policy instruments. The philosophy that we're taking to that, and it's reflected in a consultation paper that's currently open to consultation. We very much welcome input from Australian and, importantly, international stakeholders. Principles are efficient investment in the green, clean industries of the future, level playing field between producers wherever they may be located, cooperation with and support for trade partners in the region in design and implementation ultimately of any measures that might be taken, and that relates then also to the question, of course, of potential revenue from border carbon adjustment and how that could be used. In our extensive consultations in the Asia-Pacific region, Indo-Pacific region, we have heard from many stakeholders that there's a desire to see some of that revenue perhaps used to support the establishment of monitoring and estimation systems, potentially also the establishment of systems to help with industrial decarbonization in the region. And the final point that I'd just like to tip on is the review has established that, from an Australian point of view, plurilateral and multilateral initiatives towards supporting decarbonization of heavy industry wherever they are in the world are of tremendous promise. Currently that includes, of course, the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches under stewardship of the OECD, as well as the various initiatives that the Climate Club is undertaking.
Great, thank you so much. I think the point you're making, some of the points you're making there about the level playing field have come through in all the discussions, and it's something I wouldn't mind picking up a bit in the discussion. But first of all, thank you to all of our panelists for their contributions. That's really been the beginning of a terrific discussion. But I would like to open the floor now and see whether there are any questions from the audience. I might ask one just that in particular jumped out at me. Perhaps if I could put it to you, Minister Utoikamanu, you talked about the things that were important to the Pacific, and I think a lot of them resonated with me, having seen the way the Pacific approached the negotiations that Alice was talking about in the World Trade Organization on fisheries subsidies, where actually the Pacific Islands were a very influential voice. I'm wondering whether you feel that as a small island developing state, Tonga, or as part of the Pacific group of members of the WTO or of COP, whether you're feeling that your voice is being heard enough when it comes to what is needed to help you in, whether it's an adaptation challenge or whether it's maintaining a playing field that's level, so that when other countries are taking measures, you can adapt, you can benefit.
Thank you for that question. Some of the issues that have just come onto the agenda, and decisions have really taken 30 years for the small island developing states, because right from 1992, when the small island developing states had their first meeting in Barbados, they said, we're concerned about climate change, we're concerned about sea level rise, we're concerned about loss and damage. And if you look at the wording of the outcomes which are negotiated, because it's a UN system-wide document, it's say climate change may, sea level rise may, everything was a may then. And it's taken this long through many years of voicing the concerns, not only at government level, but also, with the support of civil society, the youth, and we have come a long way, but not quite there yet, and some have given up. But I think the thinking is that if we are not around the table, even to talk about our priorities and our concerns, and whether it gets a decision comes out in our favor, but at least we have a voice rather than staying out and other people making that decision for us, and then we have no choice in it. But as a group, I think the group has come a long way in terms of really working together on common issues and pushing that, and have I think gone from strength to strength, and have had some impact. And of course, you have the Pacific Group, then you have the Alliance of Small Island Developing Countries, which is 39 countries, and then you have the G77 and China Group. But I think as you go up, it gets a bit more difficult to push the positions. But I think while I got asked this question at a different event yesterday, and I said, well, we have to fight it because we have no other choice. Yeah, there's not a plan B. We just have to push this one through, because it's a priority, and it's a life and death situation for small island developing states. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wonder, Alice, whether you've got any observations based on your experience, including the very good point which you made, that I acknowledge, which is that in the World Trade Organization, I think the starting point for discussions on trade and environment has largely been a developed country one, and whether there are strategies that you've seen that have been successful or that could be successful in integrating the voices of smaller island states into shaping the outcomes that we're seeking.
Sorry, I think there are a number of things that I've seen work, and the first thing I'm going to say is that it sounds a bit ridiculous, but sometimes there's not a lot of listening in the big global forums and in the negotiations. I'll never forget the ambassador of one developed country who I paid a courtesy call on just as he was leaving, and he said, thank you for the work you do. Oh, very nice. You enabled me to talk to people I don't usually talk to. It wasn't an Australian ambassador, it was another one. And it struck me that sometimes it is actually difficult for governments to talk to each other and listen to each other. And it can seem difficult to believe until you've been in the government and you realize how reliant you can become on your own talking points, and how little time you have to move from one issue to the next. And how often sometimes you can assume that you can assume what your interlocutor is going to tell you simply because of the country they come from and what you heard that country say 2 years ago. So So active listening, it sounds a bit trite, but I think it's actually increasingly incredibly important. I think there's a real role for civil society organizations like mine when they organize events, and we do this a lot, is to make sure that we are bringing to the fore the voices of small island developing states, of ambassadors, of representatives from countries who, again, don't have a lot of time to dedicate to things, whose formal position in a negotiation is often expressed through very large groupings. In the WTO, it's the Africa, Pacific and Caribbean grouping, the ACP, which is itself a huge and extremely diverse grouping of countries. And being able to bring an individual specific country's voice forward is something that civil society organizations, I think, can help to do, precisely because, our only interest in shaping a discussion is that it be inclusive and helpful, right? Where there's no risk that by inviting somebody whose position is different, we undermine our position. We can do that. We have that flexibility. And the very last thing is that I do want to give, not just because I'm being hosted by the Australians, but particular credit to Australia and New Zealand in the WTO, because I think they are taking very seriously their role as the larger countries in the Pacific, in enabling the Pacific voice to come forward, in supporting Pacific Island negotiators, in being the active listeners who will stop and take the time to really hear what the Pacific is worried about and think through what the solutions could be and use their own diplomatic weight in a large and competitive environment to bring those interests forward. So credit to the two larger powers in the region, because I think that helps.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor?
Hello, thank you, Ambassador. Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. In the previous session, Frank, you were talking about, we can only subsidise our way to a green economy to a certain degree. We need demand, and obviously in an international trade context, creating those demand centres for Australia is critical so that we can develop those industries. It strikes me that one of the ways we do that, ultimately we want a global trade order that is facilitating that, but there's stepping stones between where we are now and getting there, and it strikes me that bilateral relationships with countries that are looking to decarbonise but need the supply that we can potentially provide is one avenue for providing those stepping stones to a broader global trade order. Are you seeing any of you in your engagement internationally, appetite from countries that might want to buy what we're selling and actually enter into deeper strategic relationships with Australia to enable that collaborative decarbonisation?
The questions too, isn't it?
So there are probably a whole lot of Australian government people better qualified than me to answer that question. I would say there is some. There is definitely some. Whether it's enough at this stage to get to the point you're talking about, where the market's operating on its own, is not something I have I wouldn't say I'm confident that it's there yet, but I really don't have good visibility. So you're probably better qualified in some ways.
I'll be happy to add something here. So the contention, of course, is that a sustainable system of low and zero emissions industrial production can ultimately not rely on individual countries subsidizing production, right? Because, for fiscal sustainability, and also because, what's the competitive situation with producers who might choose the traditional high emissions way of producing, and it won't work in the long term. What you need is demand for the low emissions commodities of the future, right? The surefire, efficient way to create that is through carbon pricing or different measures that provide a financial incentive in that way. border carbon measures have the opportunity to expand that system internationally, right? And that's, of course, where all of this sort of international conversation comes in about what the precise effects are, what the ways are in which this could be implemented while being fully compatible with and supportive of an open and rules-based international trading system, as is absolutely imperative, I think, from the point of view of a relatively small and very, very open economy like Australia's, right? Now, when we come to bilateral conversations, right, and when the conversation is in the space of a truly level playing field for low emissions industrial production, right, that is actually something that tends to be a very positive conversation, including in developing countries, right? Because it's not the case that facilities in rich countries are clean and in developing countries are high emissions. No, that may be the stereotype. In some cases that's true on average, but you find plenty of low emissions, relatively low emissions, highly efficient facilities in developing countries. It's usually the latest plant that's built that's the highest efficiency, lowest emissions plant. Okay? And so that competition is certainly not one that necessarily disadvantages developing countries. It's one that incentivizes investment and greater production in the localities that can do it at lowest carbon emissions, and that's how it should be.
Thank you. We might have time for one more question if there's a burning one out there. Doesn't seem to be. Just check with the panelists. None of you have a burning question for each other? Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for everyone coming along. Thank you very much to the panelists. I think we have made a little bit of contribution to raising consciousness here this morning about the potential of better linkages between the climate and trade shaping discussions to be mutually reinforcing, and I think also touched on some of the risks that some countries see, especially some more vulnerable countries see if those discussions don't go in the right way. And I think both of those elements are important for us to bear in mind as government officials and other stakeholders in the discussions, both the opportunities and the risks, and the need really to continue to work actively to build the conversation and the understanding. And I really think the panel's been a very good representative group for the different elements that can contribute to that effort, and really thank them for their comments this morning. So thank you.